So climate change is making our air pollution problems worse, but we are nowhere near where we were in even the early 2000s.
Hello to our lovely Golden State followers. I'm Paul Thornton, co-founder and managing editor of Golden State, your nonprofit source for fearless journalism and commentary that seeks to inform, not inflame. If you're watching us on YouTube, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like and subscribe buttons below. It helps the channel. So let's get to today's topic, which is smog, or the air, as someone from Southern California, that I've been breathing my whole life. Right now, the parts of the federal government that make sure our air is safe to breathe and our kids have a future in a world with climate change is actually under attack by the Trump administration. So I can think of no one better to talk about this today than Ann Carlson, a professor of environmental law at UCLA. She's one of the foremost experts in this country on climate change law and policy. Most recently, she served in the Biden administration, leading the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And most importantly, she is a native of Southern California. Her new book on smog, it's called Smog and Sunshine, the surprising story of how Los Angeles cleaned up its air, and it's out next month. Professor Carlson, thank you for being here.
Sure, great to be here.
I kind of want you to set the scene for us. Los Angeles and Southern California now, we still get dinged for bad air. But as your book makes clear, today's air it's actually a vast improvement over what we were breathing in the 1980s. That's when I was a kid growing up here. And even further back, the 70s, the 60s, and so on. My mother would tell me the air was bad. I tell my kids the air was bad. You grew up in this area. What was it like for you and for your community members?
Yes, I grew up in Fullerton, so a bit east of where you are, where the air quality was terrible and yet not quite as bad as the air further east in places like Riverside and San Bernardino. I don't think people can begin to understand just how awful it was. Let me give you a couple of anecdotes. My parents moved to Southern California in the 1950s. My dad was joining the aerospace engineering world, and my mother was a kindergarten teacher. And they drove from Chicago, like many Midwestern transplants. They were looking for sunshine, and they drove in August. And my mother started teaching kindergarten in Compton. And she remembers very vividly a day in October when it was very windy outside, and her fellow teachers didn't want to take the kids outside because of the wind. She was from Chicago. She thought nothing of the wind. And she went onto the playground and looked around and for the first time realized there were mountains that ring the Los Angeles space, and she'd never seen them before. And she'd been here for more than 2 months. So that's one picture of how bad it was. There were many days that airlines couldn't land at the local airports because they couldn't see the runway. There were car crashes as a result of lack of visibility. On more than half of the days of the year in the 1970s, you couldn't see more than 3 miles. It's just so much cleaner than it used to be. And I think many people don't understand that.
What do we mean when we talk about smog? And I ask that because I hear haze, I hear smoke and fog. I hear all these different terms, but smog seems to be this all-encompassing category.
Yeah, I think most people, when they are thinking about smog, think about two kinds of air pollutants that cause smog to be visible. So one is ozone pollution, and that's the pollutant we have the most difficulty continuing to meet in Southern California. Another is fine particulate matter, really wonky name for tiny, tiny particles that occlude visibility. Those particles in the air were what made the mountains impossible to see. But when we're talking about cleaning up Los Angeles air, there are many other pollutants. And so let me give you one example that I think really illustrates how far we've come. So when I was a kid in the 1970s, okay, I was a teenager, I was a kid in the 1960s, everybody used leaded gasoline until the invention of the catalytic converter, which caused gas stations to be required to offer unleaded gasoline because catalytic converters would corrode with leaded gasoline. Lead concentrations in the atmosphere in the 1970s were 50 times higher than they are today. 50, 50, not 15. And kids had blood lead levels that were 1,000% higher than the blood lead levels we saw in children in Flint, Michigan after the drinking water scandal. Lead was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And we all suffered as a result. There are many, many health consequences from exposure to lead. And those health consequences are now largely gone.
I'll just say I was floored reading that in your book about the high concentration of lead in the blood of children in areas of Los Angeles. Do you know of anyone who's ever measured what we might have lost generationally to all that time breathing in that kind of air in Los Angeles?
I do. I mean, there are estimates about hundreds of thousands of lives saved as a result of cleaning up air. That means that people were dying of respiratory disease, of cancer, of heart disease, all of which are affected by smog. There are also some really interesting studies about what exposure to lead did to children. So there are estimates that we collectively lost 3 to 5 IQ points each if you were born in the 1960s or early 1970s. The lead was so pervasive, and part of the problem with lead is that it's heavy. When it came out of the tailpipes of cars, it would deposit on the land. And so if you think about kids on a playground, that's always the vision I have. You grab the monkey bars or you're sitting on a bench and you're touching lead, and then you put your hands in your mouth because you're a kid. It's what kids do. So we were basically eating lead that came out of the tailpipes of cars. Lead causes all kinds of problems. In addition to drop in IQ, there are some studies that suggest that violent crime is connected to lead exposure, and that one of the reasons we had particularly high crime rates in the 70s and 80s was because of what lead was doing to kids' brains. It affects the nervous system, it causes behavioral problems. At high levels, it can be toxic. It kills people. And it was everywhere in our environment.
Every city in America is dirty, though. But what was it about Southern California that made our problem so hard to fix?
So, two reasons. One is our geography. So, we are ringed by mountains. We have the both blessing and curse of a lot of sunshine. We have actually very low wind speeds, which sounds kind of wonky, but it means that smog accumulates in the basin. We have what everyone calls an inversion layer, where there's essentially a lid on the basin that traps the smog in, and it can't blow out, partially because the winds are weak and partially because we're surrounded by mountains. So smog in other areas actually blows out of the urban area. Potentially ours could blow into Nevada or Arizona, but it doesn't because we're ringed by mountains. So geography plays a big role, geography and weather. But the other really big role was what we're famous for, and that is cars. And the reason cars were so problematic in Southern California was both because there were so many of them. Today, we actually don't drive more than average Americans do. We actually don't own cars in larger numbers than most Americans on average. But in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, our car ownership rates were way higher than most cities. And that's because of the way that Southern California developed. Didn't have a lot of public transit. In fact, public transit really died in the 1950s. And we had a lot of open land, and we grew kind of to fill that land. And we didn't have a downtown core. So you couldn't get from, one place to another without getting into a car. The other problem is that the cars had no pollution controls on them. And not only did they not have pollution controls on them, but the auto industry denied that cars cause smog. They kept pointing to stationary sources. Stationary sources is a technical term for things that don't move, like factories and power plants, oil refineries, etc. Even when we had done a reasonably good job cleaning those up, more and more cars added more and more pollution. And again, the auto industry would not acknowledge, basically denied that their product caused a problem. And then once they kind of acknowledged it, they delayed and delayed, and then they engaged in deceit. They actually engaged in a conspiracy that they settled a case over that kept pollution control technology off of the market, off of their cars for many more years than it was available.
This sounds painfully relevant to today. You call it, is it a denial, delay, deception?
Yes.
Do you think that's playing out again right now?
So the delay and the denial, delay, and deception worked for a long time. And we probably lost 20 to 30 years in our progress in cleaning up air pollution as a result. So we have seen a somewhat similar campaign by oil companies. There are a series of lawsuits right now against oil companies alleging that those companies, and the Los Angeles Times actually unveiled a lot of this along with Columbia, knew in the really starting the 1960s that climate change was going to occur. And it was going to occur as long as we kept burning fossil fuels, because fossil fuels release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that accumulate in the atmosphere and remain in the atmosphere for many years. They knew this was happening, and yet they engaged in a campaign to deny that it was happening and then to confuse the public about it. And it's been very successful. Climate change, as you know, is a controversial issue. President Trump calls it a hoax. He and his Environmental Protection Agency are in the process of rolling back every possible mechanism to attack climate change. That's clearly in part at the behest of interests that don't want to be regulated. But I do want to say something positive because it's also the case that once Congress started regulating air pollution, we got the catalytic converter, and California had a lot to do with that, as I describe in the book. You'll have to read it for all the details. But the catalytic converter and other technologies that have been used to cut pollution in cars have resulted in cars that are 99.9% cleaner than they were in 1970. That is remarkable. We've also seen on the climate change front, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy that's now being deployed. Wind and solar are cheaper now than natural gas and coal. And the result is that most new installations of energy sources in the United States and around the world are renewable sources. And we're also starting to see electric vehicles everywhere. We're doing it too slowly in the United States. We were on a pretty good path, and then the Trump administration has again rolled back all those protections. But China is now building electric vehicles that are high quality and low cost and is exporting them around the world. So there are real gains, even as the interests that stand to lose from those gains fight as hard as they can to maintain the primacy of fossil fuels. It doesn't all rest on us. It's terrible that the United States has decided that it doesn't need to lead on an issue that it helped create and it could benefit from economically. I mean, green technology, that's what China's doing. China is the global leader again. They are selling their technology around the planet. And we have just decided that that's not a game we want to play.
Yeah, it sounds like they're maybe it's not okay to call it an off the shelf method for dealing with climate change, but reading about California's history and the persistence of the activists who really worked to make this happen, and some personalities, which I want to get into in a little bit because there are some fascinating personalities in your book. It seems like, yeah, there's a bit of a manual that's written for us.
We know how to do this.
Yeah.
We know what the sources are. We even have the technology, which wasn't true when we started attacking air pollution. And part of that is because we actually have been working to cut greenhouse gases. There have been lots of policies to promote renewable energy, including federal tax incentives that have spurred the development of wind and solar and so forth. Those are all disappearing now, I'm afraid, under the current administration. But we know how to do this. We also know this is not a one shot deal. And one of the lessons of cleaning up Los Angeles' air is it took decades and we're not done. We continue to have pollution problems. I don't want to, undersell that. We have um, environmental justice hotspots for people who live near polluting sources like freeways and the ports and increasingly warehouses. So we need to continue to fight and we shouldn't let up. But it's also the case that even with setbacks, and we had setbacks in the air pollution context, we just have to continue to move forward, push forward, put public pressure on our politicians. That was an extraordinarily important part of the story of air pollution. We need to keep that up for climate change.
I actually want to ask you about the difficulties that people who are sounding the alarm on this faced early on. One personality in your book, Ari Hagen-Smith, my gosh, a Caltech chemist in the 1940s who was studying pineapple flavor, but somehow he becomes the father of air pollution regulation. If you wrote a character like that in a movie, I almost wouldn't believe it. His reputation really came under attack in a way that sounds familiar. I mean, I know you've come under attack in Senate hearings, and there are people like Ari Hagen-Smith who have almost had their careers ruined.
Yeah, he's a great character. He's a Dutch scientist who comes to Caltech in the 1950s with his wife, who is a botanist, and they moved to Caltech. And of course, Caltech is in Pasadena, which is at the base of the mountains and experiences a lot of smog. But he doesn't study smog initially. As you said, he's a pineapple chemist. He's literally studying the flavor of the pineapple and getting money from Dole and, other food companies. And he gets asked to, by agricultural interests, by farmers, because he's part of a committee for the city of Los Angeles, he gets asked about why agricultural crops are dying. And they're dying because they're exposed to smog. And he basically says, well, if you want to know what's killing them, you got to study what smog is. And so that's what he does. And it turns out being a pineapple chemist is a very handy skill set for determining what constitutes smog. The early idea is, well, it must be what's coming out of pipes of, tailpipes of cars and smokestacks, et cetera. But it turns out that it's not coming out in heavy enough concentrations to explain the smog in the air. And he has this hypothesis, which he then tests. His hypothesis is that if you expose these chemicals to sunshine, they will catalyze and turn into smog. And so he builds this chamber outside his office that's made out of plexiglass. It's got to be see through, right? So the sun can come in, and he recreates smog. They call it Hagen smog. And, and it's a brilliant discovery. And do you think the car companies and the oil industry buy it? Of course not. So first he gets attacked pretty viciously by the oil industry. It's actually not the car companies that attack him, it's oil because they sell gasoline. And so they have an interest here in staving off any kind of regulation. And they besmirch his reputation. And that actually emboldens him to fight harder. He's just so angry at his reputation being smeared. And eventually everybody has to come to acknowledge that the science is correct. But the car companies just ignore it. So they just act like it doesn't exist. There's scientific journal articles showing his science, and they act like they don't exist. So he's both vilified and ignored, but he ultimately gets the last laugh because in early 1960s, he becomes the first chair of what ultimately becomes the Air Resources Board in California that regulates emissions coming from vehicles.
Which is still with us and still a very powerful force. Before he came along, we were attacking the problem, but attacking it wrongly.
Yes.
Um,
Lots of good intentions that kind of got off on the wrong track.
right. Because Los Angeles is not any of the other cities. You write about St. Louis. We imported someone from St. Louis to become, was it the Los Angeles Times that hired
Yes.
him?
The Los
Yeah.
Angeles Times hired him to conduct basically a study of Los Angeles smog. He came out and did all sorts of things, and he concluded that Los Angeles had the same problem as St. Louis, which is that it was largely the burning of coal and other industrial sources, and that cars didn't have anything to do with the problem. And he said, if you clean up the sources that I tell you to clean up, the smog problem will go away. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And that was another setback. It was the front page above the fold headline, his findings. The Times commissioned him to do this. Times put a lot of resources into trying to figure out what we should be doing about smog. But we got off on the wrong foot, and it wasn't until Hogensmith basically proved everyone wrong and showed, in fact, it is cars. Cars are the problem, that we began to attack. But that was a slow process.
Yeah, but his experiment, and there are other experiments that you note in the book, and I don't want to give it away because it's really fascinating. His experiment was really an aha moment. You could see it. You could
Yes.
see it immediately.
Yes. And the plexiglass was genius, right? Because people could actually view what he was creating.
But it's not just scientists like him. You mentioned the Mothers of East Los Angeles, a legendary group in Los Angeles. The leader of that movement, she died a little over or a little less than a year ago.
Right.
They staged some theatrics
Right.
um, just to highlight how this was affecting them. Can you talk about that and maybe how that might instruct movements going forward?
Sure. So Juana Gutierrez started the Mothers of East LA, and her central mission was to draw attention to the fact that East LA was basically a dumping ground for facilities that no one else wanted. And so she fought against a prison, but the one that really brought attention to the group was fighting an incinerator that was going to be about a mile from USC, along with another group, Concerned Citizens of South Central, and brought attention to the fact that we disproportionately burden communities, typically of color, typically low income, with these polluting sources, assuming there will be no resistance. And she resisted. And she and a group of mothers wore white kerchiefs and pushed baby strollers across a bridge in East Los Angeles into downtown. They would do this repeatedly to draw attention to the fact that their kids were going to be poisoned by these sources of pollution. And she really is in California, I think the really foundation of what today we think about as environmental justice. There's a group that precedes Mothers of East LA that's also important for its theatrics called Stamp Out Smog. And it's started by a very different group. This is a group of basically Hollywood ladies, women who are married to fancy Hollywood executives and actors. And they do things like wear gas masks to political meetings to show that they can't breathe. And they have incredibly great signage with not only do the signs say clever things, but they look great. If you buy the book, you can see pictures of them. And it really shows how important activism is because the politicians respond to public pressure. And public pressure really grew and grew and grew. Starting in the 1950s is when we really started to see very organized groups of protesters at meetings, hundreds of people showing up at city council meetings, showing up at candidate meetings, and so forth. And then in the 1980s, we see Juana Gutierrez shift the focus away from it's not just an air pollution problem, it's an air pollution problem that burdens some communities much more heavily than others. And it's very powerful, and she wins. They stop the incinerator. So she succeeds. And the Stamp Out Smog folks got themselves appointed. One of them was on the Air Resources Board. They became technical experts, and that way they could educate politicians about what needed to be done. So the power of activism is such an important part of this story, and I think such an important part of what we need to do to keep the focus on cutting greenhouse gases.
Gas prices are really in the news. And you devote one of your chapters to driver behavior. And you mention gas prices as something that can nudge people toward electric vehicles. Right now in California, we're talking about gas tax holidays in California, which has we've lived with over $4 gas for a long time.
Right.
There's an outcry in some quarters to reduce controls on refineries, which in your book are a major villain. And the effort to regulate refineries was a hard fought effort in certain neighborhoods. Is there anything that concerns you now listening to this call for lower gas prices, fewer regulations on refineries?
Well, I will start with the fact that we have incredible shock in gas prices. This is no way to set policy, right? We're seeing, the price of oil going up well above $100 a barrel, 25% or larger spikes in gas prices. That is not okay for households that are lower income, that have gas propelled vehicles. That's not sustainable. It is ironically the case that higher gas prices as a result of the Iran war will likely lead to higher electric vehicle sales because people are very sensitive to gas prices. And when they see them go up like that, they start to see the benefits and values of electric vehicles. But I don't think that's the way we ought to be setting policy. We ought to be much more rational about this. Tax incentives, I think, are, a very good way. They're actually much more politically feasible. I mean, raising gas taxes is not a popular thing. But it is also the case that one of the reasons that we have been slower, I think, to shift to electric vehicles is because gas prices have been quite low. If you look at Europe, you see a much bigger uptake. Europe taxes gasoline at much, much higher prices. You see it per liter prices when you go to Europe. It's always shocking to
But
see.
not diesel, as you point out.
Not diesel, although and diesel has a particularly strange history in Europe and in the United States with Dieselgate. So I guess the long and the short of it is I think, using war to drive up gas prices is probably not a great climate policy, but ironically could lead to the reduction of greenhouse gases.
I alluded to this earlier. And we actually shifted our conversation to climate change quite early on because that's the issue now. Even though cleaning up the quality of air, of course, is still a work in progress. Pardon me, I'm going to look at my phone, and I think I sent this to you earlier. But last night in Alhambra, where I was on my Air Now app, the AQI was 185. Um, I haven't seen many of those days in uh, my adult life.
Except for
Um,
wildfire days, as you pointed out. That's
well,
wildfire, yeah.
and the 4th of July.
Yes, 4th of July, one of our biggest particulate matter days.
It was actually quite shocking to look off in the distance yesterday and see smog. I want you to put the 185 reading in historical context. How does that compare to past bad days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 185 AQI is, as you say, high and rare, and it pales in comparison to what we used to breathe almost every day. So I was born in 1960. We used to have smog alerts. I'm sure you remember them because you grew up in Southern California before they were a thing of the past.
Recess was canceled.
Recess was canceled routinely. The year I was born, more than close to 300 days that year, we had at least a stage one smog alert, which is about,
300.
yeah, something like 286 days.
Wow.
And so they were so commonplace that we ignored a lot of the admonitions not to play outside. I'm sure you're familiar with lungs burning and eyes stinging as a result of just being outside on a sunny day in the summer, right? Doing anything physical, swimming, or whatever you were doing, running around, playing tag, playing tennis, whatever it was, playing baseball. And so we haven't had a smog alert since 2003. Even when you see those AQI readings, they are nothing close to what used to be an ordinary day in Southern California. So it really is important to keep in mind the relative improvement is so dramatic. So when people say to me, well, your air quality is terrible, that's why I get so defensive, because people don't understand what we've accomplished. It's extraordinary what we've accomplished. And it's the result of government, it's the result of those community leaders we've talked about, it's the result of scientists like Ari Hagensmith. It's the result of political leaders, and we shouldn't lose sight of that because people shouldn't be cynical about government. We can do this. We have done it before, and even though we have these setbacks, and I will say these setbacks are made worse by climate change. One of the reasons the AQI is high is because it was 95 degrees yesterday. 95 degrees in March. I don't ever remember a day of 95-degree weather in March. Our scientists are telling us it's 5 times more likely that we have these hot days in March because of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And when it's hotter, we get worse ozone pollution. When it's hotter, we get more wildfires. Those wildfires also spew terrible things into the air. So climate change is making our air pollution problems worse. But we are nowhere near where we were in even the early 2000s.
And do you think even if climate change, God forbid, it spirals, LA's air is going to be clean, relatively clean?
Yes. With the exception of the wildfire days, and that's a whole different problem to actually control the wildfires. We know climate change is causing them, but the conventional pollution controls don't work to stop the wildfires immediately. So there are lots of things that need to be done. There's lots of focus right now on trying to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, and those wildfires. Some of those days can be really, really bad, but even still, they're not approaching the terrible smog that we experienced on a regular basis for decades.
So I can tell people if you want to feel hopeful about our future while also understanding that there's a lot of work to be done, read Professor Carlson's book, which is out when, Professor?
April 7th, but it's available for pre-order now. This is meant to be a hopeful book. It is meant to celebrate government and to show what can happen if we coalesce around an issue and fight hard. We can make extraordinary gains, and we have done so in Southern California. I want people to understand that.
Professor Carlson, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for writing what I also found to be a bit of a love letter to
It
Los
is a
Angeles.
love letter. I am, as I say, I'm LA's fierce defender. I feel very defensive when people attack my city.